What's up, miniature painters? Today we're painting Emberling for the Dragon Eclipse board game. I'm going to get the character itself painted up pretty quickly today using an airbrush and an oil wash, while most of my effort is going to be spent on the flame and OSL as the key focal point for this piece. The most obvious artistic choice that I'm making today is choosing bright blue for the color of the flame. I feel that painting a blue OSL glow will make for a more interesting interaction with the orange dragon behind it. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. I begin with a model that is fully primed with a flat black primer, then I cover the entire body with a base layer of burnt red. I recommend burnt red even though I'm actually using dark crimson on my miniature here. This is a great color, but I did not realize that it's actually a gloss paint until painting was underway. This just makes it a little more difficult for additional layers to adhere to this dark red base coat. I pressed on without issue because I'm applying the next couple of layers with an airbrush. But if I were layering up with a dry brush or traditional layering, I would choose burnt red as the base layer or follow the glossy dark crimson with a matte varnish before continuing. The next layer is a 50-50 mix of dark crimson and orange pro acryl. Because these are standard acrylic paints instead of airbrush paints, I thin them quite heavily with airbrush thinner. I mix 7 to 10 drops of thinner for every 1 drop of paint to achieve an almost water-like consistency for the paint. I also have my compressor set relatively low at about 15 psi or 1 bar. This low pressure will help alleviate any spider webbing that can occur when airbrushing with such thin paints. This layer is sprayed mostly from above on all features of the character except for the belly. The final layer through the airbrush is pure orange pro acryl. This is sprayed from above to highlight the dark orange layer that came before. It accentuates the high points and protrusions of the character's various features. Going back to the glossy dark crimson, another reason that I was fine with the high gloss base coat is that the durability of this paint job isn't going to be an issue for me. I don't actually own this game, this is a prototype miniature, so it's not going to get handled as a board game piece. If I were going to use this as a game piece, then I would have sprayed the dark crimson with a matte varnish before proceeding with the additional layers. I base coat the dragon egg with dark plum. This is the only paint that is required for the egg other than the OSL. I'll demonstrate painting the dots on the egg as well for those who aren't interested in the blue glow effect from the flame, but these lighter dots will be completely covered by the blue light that comes later. I'm going to paint Emberling's belly scales, spines, horns, and patagium with lighter colors, so I begin with a medium brown base coat on these areas. This will set me up for success with the lighter colors that follow and will require less total coats of paint than if I were to attempt to paint the lighter colors directly over the black primer. This brown will also remain visible as the main color at the base of each horn and spine. I jump straight to yellow ochre for the main color of the spines, horn, lower jaw, and ventral scales. For the belly area, I apply pretty thorough coverage as this will get darkened with the wash later. Most of the belly will be covered with the OSL effect, but I want to paint all of it with this yellow color now because I'm not exactly sure how much area will be covered by the blue glow at this point. I want to avoid having to come back with the yellow ochre after putting in the OSL. I paint most of the upper portion of each horn and spine, leaving just a little chocolate brown visible at the root of each protrusion. Next, I highlight the ends of each horn and spine with a little necrotic flesh by the army painter. I also use this to edge highlight any ridges that are present on the dragon's horns. I also dot this on all of the teeth. Now I'm using orange pro acryl to increase the opacity of the orange on specific scales around Emberling's body. The details on this miniature are surprisingly soft. The flame in particular is devoid of any real depth in the form of ridges or valleys that I typically see with sculpted fire. The dragon scales themselves are sparse and not uniformly spread over the entire body. This makes it easy to highlight the scales as they are clustered mostly around the thigh, shoulder, and forearms. The dragon's lower body is mostly smooth, so hitting the few visible scales there is a breeze. I say that the soft details on this mini is surprising because it's a stark contrast to the elk thorn miniature that I had previously painted for this game. That particular miniature had crisp details that were a joy to paint. I'm still having fun painting this little guy, but I was expecting it to require more effort on the details that I'm actually putting in. I'm using Salmon Rose to thoroughly paint the patagium, or wing skin, on the dragon. I'm not really using a traditional layering process like I normally would for this type of miniature, because I know that I'm going to follow it with a wash later. This is more of a base, shade, highlight, speed painting approach that I'm using for this character. Once the wings are all covered, I'll use this color to paint the dots on the egg. I feel that this color is a nice contrast to the dark plum behind it. At least for now it is. It's all going to get completely covered by the OSL in just a minute. This color is also close enough to white to use it as a bright glint of light in the dragon's black eyes. The last step before the wash goes on is to paint the base. There are just two elements to paint on the base, the dirt and the stone. I'm not exactly sure what the two sets of spikes are supposed to be on the ground, so I'm treating them like spiky stone outcroppings. If they're supposed to be grass, then they really should have been sculpted more convincingly. I'm using a dark brown followed by a medium brown dry brush for the dirt, and I'm using a dark gray followed by a medium gray dry brush for the stone elements. This is all that's necessary for the base. I don't want it to stand out too much and steal the show from the main character. Besides, much of it will be affected by the blue light that's cast by the flames. Now it's time to slather the miniature with a dark purple oil pen wash. I made this wash with dark purple oil paint and added about 10 parts mineral spirits for every 1 part oil paint. Then I cover the miniature using a soft bristled paintbrush that I reserved specifically for this purpose. After getting the miniature completely covered, I let it sit for about 10 minutes before beginning the removal process. A good rule of thumb is to let it dry just enough so that it isn't shiny anymore. I really want to stress just how gentle this removal process is. I'm more using the sponge to absorb the oil wash rather than scrub it. If I ever feel that the dry sponge isn't removing enough wash, I simply dampen it with a little mineral spirits. This is always a safer option than merely pressing harder with the sponge. My usual timeline when using these oil washes is to get all of the acrylic base layers in place and let it dry for about 2 hours or so. Then I apply the oil wash that same day, and after I remove it, I let the mini dry overnight before continuing with the acrylics. It's a very fast way to paint, but the dry time for the oil does increase the overall time it takes to complete the project. Normally I would complete a miniature like this in a single painting session, but when using an oil wash it takes 2 much shorter painting sessions to complete. Once the oil wash is completely dry, I establish the base for the OSL Glow with an airbrush and some Leviathan Blue contrast paint. This paint only needs to be thinned about 50-50 with airbrush thinner. Contrast paints seem to flow much better through the airbrush than standard acrylic paints. I try to spray this dark blue from the location of the flame and hit all of the surfaces that would be affected by the blue light. Using an airbrush for this step makes it much easier to locate where the light would affect the model as opposed to manually placing it with a standard paintbrush. Next, I use Vallejo Electric Blue as the main color for the reflected light. I basically paint this color within the Leviathan Blue foundation, without obscuring all of it. I want this electric blue to fade into the Leviathan Blue around the outer edges of this glow. I also make sure to leave separation between the areas affected by the electric blue color. I paint the various scales and features individually and leave a little Leviathan Blue showing between the various attributes on the model. After painting some fairly opaque electric blue areas, I switch to a dry brush to intensify the edge highlights. This dry brushing also allows the electric blue to blend into the surrounding Leviathan Blue more naturally and makes applying this glow to the sculpted base faster and easier. The final step for the blue glow on Emberling is to add a little bold titanium white to the electric blue and further refine the brightest blue points on the dragon. Much of this color is dry brushed on the model using an old size 2 round brush. I'm adding this to the point on each feature of the character that is most directly facing the light source. Most of the sharp edges of the scales and other body parts get an edge highlight of this color. I'm also paying special attention to the features of the face, not just because the face is closest to the flame, but also because I would like to have more of the viewer's attention drawn towards this character's face. The face receives more of this light blue highlight color than any other areas of the body. With this glow complete, we next need to paint the source of this light, which is the flame. This flame should be brighter than the blue glow on the body, so I'm beginning with the solid foundation of bold titanium white to brush the inks over. I'm setting up 4 Daler-Rowney inks in a dry palette before beginning the flames. I'm using cyan, turquoise, fluorescent blue, and fluorescent yellow. Leviathan blue will come into play later to darken the flame tips, but I'm not setting that up on my palette at the moment. Fluorescent yellow doesn't really play a role in this paint scheme. I started out with it initially, but I pretty quickly painted over it with white. I'm listing it here because some of the following footage is going to have some obvious yellow layers in it, and I don't want to confuse anyone. The yellow wet blending with the blue to make a green transition does look extremely cool, but I am not about to redo all of the reflected blue light on the body to accommodate this flame color. Painting the flames is a very relaxing, fluid process. I keep switching back and forth between various colors, making the internal area of the flames lighter while working toward a darker blue for the outer parts of the flame. I even return to the bold titanium white several times when I feel that I've built up the blue a little too much. The turquoise ink has a noticeable amount of white pigment in it, making it much more opaque than the other 2 blue inks. Generally speaking, the lighter areas, like near the mouth and around the wispy parts of the flame, receive a lighter touch, using fluorescent blue directly over the titanium white paint. The turquoise is used mostly as a transition color between the lighter fluorescent blue and the darker cyan on the outer parts of the flame. Once I have the blue flame close to how I want it, I grab Leviathan blue to darken the flame tips. First, I apply it full strength to just the very ends of the flames. Then I dilute it a little bit with water to blend the dark tips more naturally with the surrounding cyan ink. I still occasionally make adjustments to other parts of the flame as I see fit. When it's all finished, I think this looks like a perfectly suitable light source for the reflected light on the dragon's body. And with that, we're basically done painting. All that's left is to touch up a few of the details on Emberling's body. I start by applying orange pro-acryl to Emberling to highlight the orange scales as well as re-establishing the main features of the face. I'm doing this to brighten some of the scales that were darkened by the wash. This will be the brightest highlight for the scales, wing arms, and other orange features of the main body. I resist the urge to go any brighter with these highlights because I don't want to undermine the glow of the flame on the dragon's underside. For the face, I do take the highlights one step further by adding a little ice yellow to the orange pro-acryl. These are much smaller highlights that fit well within the basic orange highlights from the previous step. Ice yellow is used all on its own to highlight the tips and edges of the horns. I'm also using this to touch up the dragon's brow and make this the brightest point on the face. Finally, I return to the Vallejo Salmon Rose to polish the look of the wings. The purple oil wash settled nicely into the crevices and folds of the wing skin and only slightly tinted the raised surfaces of the patagium after the removal step. Some quick lines of salmon rose right above the wing fingers will make the perfect final touch for the wings. I particularly like how the purple wash makes the salmon rose look even more pink than it normally looks all on its own. I am very pleased with how this turned out, going with a blue flame instead of the typical orange fire. I feel that the contrast between the blue flame and the orange body improves the overall aesthetic of this piece, especially when filmed against a black background. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.